Well, hello everyone. It's Trevor Horwitz here. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of InfraGard Atlanta to our webinar, Hacking the Human, How Social Engineering Owns Our Users. We have a great set of panelists and we're looking forward to a great session. Before we begin, a little bit about InfraGard. InfraGard is a partnership between the FBI and the private sector. And if anyone is interested to be part of InfraGard, you can apply for membership at infragard.org. There's no cost to apply for membership, and it's a fantastic organization to be part of. A quick disclaimer here that the views and opinions and content of the webinar are solely those of the speakers and the contributors, and these views are not necessarily representative of InfraGard or InfraGard Atlanta Members Alliance. I want to introduce our first speaker, my good friend Jeff Reach. Jeff, why don't you say hello to our audience?
Well, hello, everyone. And Trevor, I really want to thank you for including me on this, and it's good to be back with you on another webinar. You can see my bio there. I'll just say I'm the Chief Security Officer for Barricade.io, and I've been in the security space for a bit over 40 years.
Thanks, Jeff. It's a pleasure to have you. Our next panelist is also a good friend, Len Sutton. Len, why don't you say hello to our audience? Len, are you there?
I beg your pardon, I was on mute. I've been in IT ever since I got out of college and had a full head of hair, so you can just imagine from that photo how long ago that was. I've been very fortunate in working with Trevor on and off for over 20 years and various opportunities in information security and controls, and I'm currently the Vice President of Managed Security Services for TrustNet here.
Well, thanks, Len. Again, also welcome to the webinar. And Bill Morrison is our third panelist, and Bill is also on the board of InfraGard Atlanta. I want to welcome Bill. Would you like to say a few words, Bill?
Thank you. Yes. Again, as you said, I'm on the Atlanta InfraGard board here in Atlanta, and I've been in the industry for about 25 years in IT, with more than half of that, actually about 23 of that in security, in various forms, from incident response, threat and vulnerability management, and working with policies and staff on up in various high-tech firms.
Great, thanks, Bill. And lastly, just a quick intro on myself, Trevor Horwitz. I'm the CISO at TrustNet, and as I mentioned before, I'm also the president of Atlanta InfraGard, and it's a pleasure to have everyone on our webinar this afternoon. So I want a quick shout out to the InfraGard Atlanta Platinum chapter sponsors. These are three organizations, amongst others, that support us, and we're very grateful for that. And also shout out to TrustNet, who are the webinar sponsors for this session. So please do everything you can to support our sponsors. These guys help us make this happen. So a couple of FAQs. Firstly, the presentation is being recorded, and the link will be sent to you at the conclusion of the webinar once it's recorded and being processed, and you'll be able to go look at the recording. And we love for these sessions to be interactive, so please go ahead and send us your questions. We'll do a Q&A at the end of the session for around 10 minutes or so. So please send us your questions. We love to make this interactive. There's a chat window on the left as well. We'll be able to send in all your questions. And just a shout out again to make sure that you stay on after the webinar. We'll be highlighting and take you to a link to register for our forthcoming webinar, which we'll talk about at the end of this. So our agenda today is going to focus on really 4 different topics. We're going to explain what social engineering is in a technical fashion, and we'll dive into the whole psychology of social engineering. We'll talk about some of the common attack techniques, and then lastly, we'll tackle the prevention strategies. I did mention we'll be doing a Q&A at the end, so plenty of time for Q&A. Make sure you send us your questions. So without further ado, let's get into talking about social engineering. So I'm going to turn it over and start my first question, and wanted to address this to to our poll, and I think we're going to start off with Jeff. Jeff, tell us a little bit about what the origins of social engineering are.
Well, I'm glad you started with me because I want to dispel the rumor that, contrary to popular belief, with my age, I wasn't there at the origin of social engineering. Not too far from it, though. I'm willing to bet that it really started in caves, that there was one caveman that found a way to convince another that his cave was better, and they switched, and he got himself an upgrade in caves that way. Going back to what was recorded, I think the first real public incident that most people are aware of social engineering was probably done by Ulysses, leader of the Greek army. You may remember that you've heard of the Trojan horse, and there are technical references to Trojan horse virus right now, or malware. But the Trojan horse was originally designed to convince the Trojans into believing that the Greeks had abandoned the fight and left, and as a offering, left the gift of the Trojan horse, which of course had the Greek army within it. So that was a methodology used by Ulysses, according to the legend and documents, that he used it to try to convince the Trojans of one thing when in fact did another. And I think that's the best basic definition and psychology behind social engineering. I want you to believe one thing, but I'm actually doing another. That can be seen in the psychology of it currently in things such as, I'm going to give you a free USB drive. Feel free to put it in your computer without checking what's on it. That's social engineering as well, because that may be a way for me to get into what you're doing. Probably one of the best current day social engineers out there is Frank Abagnale. Someone who I had the pleasure of meeting once. If you haven't heard of him and you saw the movie Catch Me If You Can, that is based on his early life story. So I think that's a good span of some of the origins of social engineering.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And just for the audience, we're running a poll, and throughout the presentation we're running various polls, so go ahead and submit your votes to that, and we'll be showing the results. I want to move on to Len and ask Len a question. Why has social engineering exploded in popularity with hackers, 2015, 2016? Seems like every second day there's something new coming out.
Well, that's a good question, and it's there's probably a number of answers. To some degree, it's a carrot and a stick type of paradigm that attackers generally don't want to be caught. They don't want to be punished or face any retribution, and they want to find an avenue through which they can be successful. Our traditional efforts at access controls, logical and physical access controls, and security, identity, and authentication management have made it fairly difficult for a lot of hackers. It requires a lot more involvement, a lot more of a technical know-how, while the social implications and the ability to manipulate people, we're still at a fairly fundamental level of understanding what that vulnerability is all about and how to defend against it. I think most people are now aware of the 4119 and Nigerian print scams, but attackers are getting a lot more sophisticated and discreet in some of the tools they're now using for social engineering. Like other hackers, there are many that are well-funded, and time is not a critical component of their objectives. They have a lot of time to develop some fairly sophisticated approaches and techniques and perfect those. But for a large degree, the popularity has increased because it works. There's little or no risk to the perpetrator. They're typically or often anonymous. They're operating across multiple jurisdictional boundaries, and law enforcement is just really not able to deal with it, investigating and pursuing it. Another key element is that there's not much of a cost to entry into that line of business. It's not a situation where a huge investment in IT and technology know-how and infrastructure has to be put in place in order to create a platform for launching this. Much of it can be done by any phone. So it's a very egalitarian, democratic type of opportunity. It doesn't require much in-depth skills. Just about anybody off the street can be trained to do it once you've got the scripts developed. And it's really a path of least resistance versus physical and logical security and techniques that we use in the rest of IT and in privacy security. And the reality is people are vulnerable. People are not continuously aware and alert and suspicious at every moment and in every situation. People are trusting. Their awareness is limited, and they can be fooled. And possibly a major issue and opportunity is that our security standards and our best practices and our risk assessment methodologies and our overall understanding of the risk landscape related to social engineering is still at a fairly immature state. Without throwing rocks at anybody at any particular standards, I think if you look, many of us are familiar with PCI, and if you look at the PCI DSS standard, there's just very little mention of social engineering. So we're still learning. We have a long way to go, and the hackers are taking advantage of it.
Yeah, that's great response. I mean, just sum up what you said, Len. It looks like we've got low cost, ease of use, and an effective strategy. That's a great recipe for success from a social engineering perspective. And Bill, one quick thing for you: how has social engineering evolved over the last several years?
Yeah, looking back on how it initially started, taking case, for example, spam, it was pretty much a shotgun approach. Let me somehow harvest a lot of emails or contact information, send something out, and hopefully, just by law of percentages, I'll get some response. So, or like taking case the 404 Nigerian scam, where people, I'm trying to, this person has died and, we're using you to exfiltrate money from a country. I mean, how legal can that be? But, for a little bit of investment, you could get $20 million. If, 1/10 or 1/100 of 1% and it was sent out to 100,000 people, somebody's going to respond and maybe kick back a little bit of money type of deal. But now today, what's the likelihood as people have become more aware and more educated? That's where we're getting more into spear phishing, or something that's very targeted to specific individuals, or a smaller group, but it's getting a more likelihood of response because you're saying something they want to hear, or something that they're truly interested in. So this goes back also to, the ultimate goal of social engineering is to trick or manipulate people. But again, if I say something on the lines of what they're already expecting, or maybe use the key phrases to set their expectation. Oh yeah, I'm really interested in that. Using spear phishing or very targeted messages increases the likelihood of something paying off. So.
Yeah, great. That's really great. A good info. So moving on to our next topic, which is the psychology of social engineering. So we've seen here that psychology plays a massive part. Maybe it's even the most important part of a social engineering attack, trying to tap into how people are thinking, hacking the human. So let's start off with a couple of different concepts. So first one is information gathering. So let's have Jeff, you talk a little bit about that.
Okay, this is, I think, the easiest part of social engineering for a couple of reasons. One, it's necessary because social engineering does create an adversarial environment. So you could consider the social engineer and the victim to be enemies, and you always want to know your enemy. And what makes social engineering easier now is that, first of all, it's always been the fact that people like talking about themselves. I'm a wonderful example of that. And what we've done with technology more recently is with Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, Facebook, and a number of other social media we have allowed people to say anything and everything they want about themselves, which gives a treasure trove of information to social engineers that want to leverage that information to take advantage of you or anyone else in particular. And I should include LinkedIn on that list as well. And I'm not saying any of these platforms are bad or evil or that you shouldn't use them, but you should be aware of what you say on them, because the more you share, and the more you share on different platforms, the easier it is for a social engineer to be able to gather all that together and create a pretty good picture of you and your lifestyle, and what you do when you're going on vacation, when you're in the office, what you do at work, and all different things like that.
That's great. An extra psychology of social engineering is the aspect is pretexting. So is pretexting when you send a text message before someone expects? That's actually my teenager responded to that. So, Len, what's the definition of pretexting?
Well, pretexting is really involved in just about all aspects of social engineering, but it's essentially defining a false scenario or framing the excuse, if you will, by which a perpetrator is going to approach a target with the explanation that what is their identity, or what is the particular peculiar circumstance that they're attempting to respond to. So it really frames the overall interaction between the perpetrator and his target or mark. And it might include someone pretending in a pretext to pretend that they are a particular person and have forgotten their password, need some help changing their password. Or it could be something as non-identity specific as a person who's either handicapped in some form or fashion, or has got their arms full and attempting to get through a doorway, and they're attempting to appeal to the target's sense of being helpful or wanting to be helpful. So it's just really the overall setting. What's the basis of the storyline that's going to be used to approach the target? The success of it is dependent on the pretext being a disarming and convincing scenario that the target's going to be open to accepting, and if it's effective, it's going to be evidenced by the target providing whatever the assistance or the information or the access that the perpetrator is attempting to achieve. So that's pretty much the pretext is to some degree is present in all of the social engineering efforts.
Okay, and Bill, how do we define elicitation?
Elicitation goes hand in hand with pretexting, where with pretexting you're pretending to set up a scenario or be someone else, but with elicitation you're trying to get information without directly asking for it. So, for example, you could say something and maybe, again, do some reconnaissance or gather some information beforehand, but let's say you're trying to gather some information to get into someone's bank account. So you could get some information like in their sites you can discover the last four of their social or something, or what their mailing address may be, and then call in to their help desk and with one or two useful pieces of information saying, for example, I don't think any of the other information you have for me is up to date. And say, all right, here's the mailing address that's accurate, but I don't think your other stuff is accurate. And say, well, the phone number we have for you is this, and the street address we have for you is that, and they'll start giving you back information because you gave them one or two pieces of true information, but, it's making the thoughts of, could this information be gathered from a public source or some other, online source perhaps. So, and just a example of where pretexting and elicitation was used, about 11 years ago, there was a Fortune 20 company that had an information leak on their board, and they're trying to figure out which board member or someone on their board of directors was leaking that information. So they hired firms to do pretexting and elicitation to various phone companies and communication companies to get phone records to try and backtrack who might have called and who talked to who. So, and the chairman of the board and several executives lost their positions because of that. So this is not necessarily a small thing.
Oh, great. So moving on from that, we're going to talk about some other psychological phenomena that are used. So the first one we're going to talk about is rapport. So how does that play into social engineering, Jeff?
Well, Trevor, we've already talked about essentially a chronology of things. There's information gathering. You talked about creating the pretext and elicitation, but you won't be successful at that unless you gain a level of trust. And with people, usually the best way to do that is to develop a rapport. And it all boils down to building a relationship with your mark or your target or your victim. If you're a social engineer, you want them to be able to trust you just for the duration of the transaction you want to conduct. You're not looking necessarily for a long-term relationship. So building relationships, the best way to do that is to develop a rapport, and the best way to develop a rapport is to find something that your target believes you have in common with them and get into that. If you know that your victim, for instance, is really into hunting deer, then you would present yourself as, an avid deer hunter, and what places are good, where do you have a good lease, those sort of things. Something that they really enjoy talking about. It's a good way to develop a level of trust that may not be based in reality, but does get them to the point where they're going to be able to share more information with you. I'm not here to plug the book, but I'm going to anyways. Robin Dreeke, who is with the FBI, wrote a book. It's Not All About Me. It's a relatively short read, but it's a great book that talks about how easy it is to build rapport with someone without having any other things in common other than the fact that you want to build a rapport with them. The name of it is It's Not All About Me.
Great. And Len, what about influence manipulation? How does that play into the whole psychology?
Well, influence and manipulation, I think it's easy to think of those as different points on a spectrum, possibly with appreciation and encouragement on one end of the spectrum and just outright coercion on the other. Influence tends to appeal to people's predisposition, their moral attitudes about life, about their sense of being a good person, helping others, doing unto others as they would have them do unto you type of an orientation. When perpetrators are leveraging influence, they might be appealing to their scenario, or their script might be that they're very much in need of help, and they're appealing to the person's predisposition to be helpful, to be trusting. Manipulation, on the other hand, is intended to create a higher level of stress on the target and to create the expectation of a more tangible or more likely reward, or possibly a more likely retribution if they fail to concur or agree or provide whatever it is that the perpetrator is attempting to accomplish. An example of a scenario that stresses urgency of quick action that it essentially frames the context in such a way that the target is made to believe or led to believe that urgency is critical in this particular situation, and therefore you don't have time to use your normal good judgment, or possibly there's the circumstances are so severe, so extreme that we just have to ignore or disregard standard protocols or standard operating procedures. But the two differ in degree and to which it's being implied, or whether there's a reward or punishment associated with the target's complying with the perpetrator. And but that's there are essentially 2 points on that spectrum.
Okay.
Many of
Thanks, Glenn.
many of the scenarios will tend to start at one end and work towards the other.
Thanks, Glenn. So our last one we're going to talk about is framing. Bill?
Framing is basically how you ask a question or make a statement that puts a spin on it, that changes what someone is thinking is reality. So an example is, think about a grocery store, and I'm trying to sell you a piece of meat and saying, I've got this meat over here that's 25% fat, but for a little bit more, I've got this piece of meat over here that's 75% lean. They're really the same thing if you think about it, but it's the way they phrase a question or make a statement that puts a spin on it that makes you think something is a little bit different or more preferable, but it's really something you need to be suspicious of. So
we got a great example on the next slide here, which actually came out of some research from Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and these are both Nobel Prize winners for some research they did in economics. And basically the example gives here where you have a scenario where you have 600 people are affected by a deadly disease, and you're asked as a participant to choose between two different treatments. And the treatments actually have the identical results, but how they framed will determine how many people will choose treatment A or treatment B. So if you do the math, they're essentially the same thing, or very close to. So in this example, the description was given of framing the treatment A, which says treatment A will save 200 lives, and then they asked people to rate that with the treatment B, and then they framed it in a second set of targets, individuals who had to answer the question, and they said 400 people will die under this treatment, and they treatment A, and then they gave another example, treatment B. Again, mathematically, these are basically the same, so it really shouldn't make a difference. But consistently, the treatment A was chosen by 72% of the participants when it was framed with a positive framing, that it saves lives, and it dropped to 22% when the same choice was presented with a negative framing. It's just an example of how this can really influence people's decision-making, and again, something that's very much used by hackers when using social engineering. So moving on to our next bunch of topics, I'm going to dive straight into this, which are some of the common attack techniques. The first one I'm sure we're all familiar with, and I'm going to pose this question to Jeff. Give us a little explanation about phishing. Jeff, are you there?
Yes, I am. Other than the fact that you might be a devotee to the band that does a good tribute to the Grateful Dead, phishing is, first of all, and not with a band, it's illegal. Because you're using any sort of electronic information, usually email, to obtain a combination of either usernames, passwords, or any credentials to get into whatever your target is. And it's the most common one you see is an email that goes out that says, I'm your bank and we're resetting your password, or we have trouble with what you have, so please give me your username and password. That's the most rudimentary one you see out there. There's something related to that called whaling that I've personally seen two instances of, not directed towards me, but where I was asked to take a look. And whaling is something that's very active right now, where an email goes to someone maybe in the Treasury Department or disbursements in a company, and the email purports to be from either the CEO or CFO, and the social engineer can usually determine that that individual is out of the office and away, saying, I'm away, but here's this business deal I'm working on, but the only way I'm going to get it done is to transfer, $50,000 to this wire to this account today. Otherwise, we don't have an opportunity for the deal. And more often than we want to admit, people feel overwhelmed by, gee, this is my CFO, this is my CEO telling me I need to do this, and they do it. It is successful at times. So that's really kind of somewhat of an extension of phishing now, which is why it's called whaling. They kept them both in the sea.
Okay, great. Well, in the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip over the phone solicitation, but essentially just using the phone as a mechanism for something we've already described. And I'm going to switch over to Bill and ask you to describe baiting for the audience.
A couple of good examples on this, but basically this is a way of, I'm going to do something that's good for you in order to get a response out of that person. So an example, for example, let's say I set up a website and say, if you create an account and log in, I will give you 10 free MP3 songs. And say, hey, something for nothing. So you log in and you click on the link to download your first song. Well, maybe you'll get malware, but you just created an account and a password on my system that probably, how many people create unique logins and passwords for every system they log into? So maybe you use Gmail or Yahoo email. I now have a password and username that I can then try to break into other pieces of information. So just by promising something to try and get access to your information. Another example that uses phone elicitation right now. In fact, I had this happen to me just this past month where somebody called me and says, hey, your system is attacking me. I want you to stop it. Well, no, it's not. Well, okay, let me log into your system and I'll find out and we'll know for sure. Here, type in this URL in a browser and I can log into your system and check for you. And so your system's attacking me. All right, I won't prosecute you or something, but let me check. And you give them access, and they're again trying to get access, trying to swap one thing for another.
Yeah, very smart, very very clever type of attack. So moving on to our next topic, which we're running a poll again for those folks who are paying attention. So go ahead and fill that in. Moving on to our next topic, we're going to talk about some prevention and mitigation strategies. So first question is, when we're talking about anti-malware, URL blocking, these type of things, how do we change the organizational culture to impact social engineering in a positive way? And I'll throw that out there to Len. Len, I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I was reading the poll. Where are we, Trevor? I'm sorry. I was reading the poll of the new questions. What was the question?
We were talking about how does organizational culture impact social engineering?
I think it affects it from a number of perspectives. I think that the culture of an organization, if it's an organization where there's a lot of awareness training on privacy, information security, intellectual property protection, you're going to see a different level of awareness for social engineering as well. I think most organizations are becoming aware that that is an attack vector that they have to be intentionally focusing on to elevate that in awareness of their people's minds. But I think you'll see organizations where that are less mature in their security programs and in their risk programs are not at all prepared for that. That they're very much vulnerable and for any of the phishing or social engineering attack vectors.
Yeah, another aspect of that I was thinking about when we were putting this together was looking at different type of cultures where you have very much like a sort of a top-down culture where everyone is expected to, their authority figure, whether it's their manager or the supervisor, sort of not to be culturally specific, but look at a typical Japanese type of organization where to question your manager or your boss is something that's not part of their culture. Whereas if you find other environments, looser environments where it's less of a hierarchy and everyone has a say and you can challenge your manager, challenge your boss, that may have an impact in terms of the overall culture of getting sucked into social engineering attacks as well. Whereas in those environments where you're taught to be skeptical and question, you're not necessarily going to fall for something as easily as maybe a culture that's more hierarchical and structured. So the next question I had here is for Jeff. How do we change organizational culture so that users will report to social engineering?
Well, there's a couple of things that have to happen, and one thing I want to mention from the previous question is one of the cultures that really opens you up for social engineering, if you're not educating yourself correctly, is an organization that says the customer always comes first. Our focus is customer service and customer support. That means you're going to be very open for whatever someone on the other end of the phone wants you to do. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. Customer service, good customer service is great. But what we need is education and situational awareness so that anyone responding to an email or picking up the phone or encountering someone in person knows here's what we do and here's what we project. Here's what we expect. Anything that's out of the ordinary of what we expect shouldn't necessarily be considered evil, but I need to treat it differently because I either don't have a script or I'm not sure how we're going to respond to that. So you need to be aware if something, first of all, seems too good to be true, it probably is. But more importantly, if something is happening other than what you should be expecting, then you should at the very least maybe get some help to say, hey, I'm not sure what this is, or what do you think of this? And if an organization doesn't encourage that, then you're going to run the risk of someone saying, I just need to figure out what's going to happen, try to do it on their own. And without that education and awareness of what might be good behavior and what isn't, you never know where you're going to end up.
Well, great. So moving on to our next slide, let's talk a little bit more about some prevention strategies. One of the things that we've listed here is categorizing phishing as a security incident. And it never really occurred to me because I guess phishing is so common, but certainly tracking the number of phishing incidents will give some credence to the organization in terms of being able to apply appropriate resources. So if you're constantly being bombarded with phishing attacks and reporting them as security incidents, at least have the ability to track them. That's going to enable you to prioritize certain activities to mitigate phishing in the future. So I really like that one that we came up with. Let's go on and talk about, on our next slide, talk about a couple of different concepts. Certainly training is an important concept. And what we've discussed here is not just training, but testing the users as well. And I know we had a question that already came through from one of the audience that said, do we endorse inoculating users against phishing attempts by sending them phishing emails? And that, in effect, is telling them, yes, we're testing you. And I think that's a very important part of this sort of prevention strategy. Let me ask anyone, want to discuss reverse authentication? Maybe Len?
I'm sorry, Trevor, there was some background noise. What was the question?
Can you explain reverse authentication?
Yeah, I'm sorry. That would be doing a validation based on previous information that was recorded and known.
Yeah, so in that example, when we have a user calls in or a user is called from the help desk and says, well, I need to have access to certain data from your system, either doing reverse authentication would be where that individual would call back and the IT department on a known number, or there's some sort of a code that's provided in order to authenticate that user so that the user knows that the individual who's calling them is who they say they are. And we see that as being built into a lot of IT help desk environments. Anyone else want to comment on any of these strategies before we move on to our next slide?
Trevor, I saw the question about whether or not we support or endorse testing with phishing efforts, and I think those are very effective. They, particularly when they're done in a non-punitive way, rather than pointing out and punishing those who may have fallen for the fish, but rewarding people and recognizing people when they're not, when they are alert and do not fall for the phishing is probably a much more socially and organizationally, culturally acceptable way of conducting that.
Yeah, Bill, you were going to say something?
Yeah, Dave, pretty much the same thing. That was spot on. That in terms of educating the people, social engineering is targeted at the human. That's the weak link in this case. So enlightening them to what's going on and why it's in not just to protect the company's intellectual property, but why it's also in their best interest, because someone coming at them through the company could get their personal information and trying more to get them on your side of why this is important to train them. And then also, like we said, there are other companies or other products out there that can send spam emails intentionally that will test people's knowledge, or that's a spam, how many people deleted it, how many opened it, how many actually clicked on the link, and then they'll tell you how we're doing. And then again, like was just said, it's spot on, using that as feedback to encourage employees and reward employees. Reward good behavior is the best way to get that behavior.
Yeah, I like that a lot, rewarding good behavior. I think some people feel like they're a victim also of social engineering attack, even after the fact. They're embarrassed by it, so they're not going to sort of fess up that they may have been suckered into it. But having a culture where it's accepted that people can come forward again without sanction, I think, is important. What about commenting on any of these other strategies you put up here? Jeff, got any comments?
Well, I'm going to reinforce that you should reinforce good behavior, and I'll also mention the converse, which is part of that. Don't punish behavior that is not what you're looking for. It's only going to get there through positive reinforcement. If people feel they're going to be punished by not doing the right thing, especially if they didn't know what the right thing was, then what you're doing is driving them further away, without a doubt. And I mentioned situational awareness before. I recommend that that's something that becomes part of your education program. And by the way, I don't think this should be security education. I think this should be cultural education within your organization that says, here's how we operate, this is what makes sense, and this is what doesn't. And when it comes to any credentials that you have, where there's something that that you can change it frequently. And as you heard mentioned earlier, don't make any of your credentials or your passwords the same for any two systems. There are enough good tools out there today that you can generate a random password and maybe even ID for virtually every system you have access to. And what we haven't talked about yet is how that should be reported. Different organizations will say, report it to the security department, and they'll work with law enforcement, whether it's U.S. CERT or the Secret Service or the FBI or local law enforcement, local or state law enforcement, but come up with a way that everyone knows that when I get social engineering, when I receive a social engineering attack, I have to make sure it's going to be reported the right way, whether the individual goes directly to law enforcement or they do it through the security team where they work.
Okay. Bill, any thoughts?
Oh, just think, especially things like email addresses, since we're talking about spam and phishing in that area, for a lot of that information, especially in the European Union, has to be treated very carefully. It's considered personal information.
No, good point. So let's just do a quick recap here on some of the lessons learned. We discussed how social engineering is on the rise, and then brought up some great points, how effective it is. It's not very difficult to do, and lastly, because it works. We spoke about how users need to understand the psychology of social engineering, and probably more importantly, IT security professionals need to understand it as well. And we spoke about what's the number one lesson we should teach users, and that's not responding to unsolicited communication without verifying the identity, doing things like reverse authentication. And lastly, we spoke about training and testing and retraining users, which seems to be the number one approach to how we mitigate the risk of social engineering. So with that, I'm going to move on and start doing just going through some questions. So we had a question which I'm going to ask you guys to respond to is, what would you recommend for random password tools, like maintaining password tools? Actually, I don't know if that's really relevant to this conversation. So let's move on to another one. The comment was from someone in Illinois: if a pen test can include social engineering and or physical security, they will get in 99% chance or more. So does that make sense to include social engineering in a pen test?
Yes, actually, I remember at Techno Security several years ago, Jack Wild had a team where they did demos of doing pen tests, not just technical, but also getting in the building. And this gentleman basically looked like anybody's grandfather. Who wouldn't want to trust them? And saying, "Can I get into your building?" And basically, that was part of their hire. It was both a cyber and a physical pen test. And how far could they get into the building? What could they do? And actually, they got pretty far. So
we have another comment from someone, one of our attendees in Georgia, which says, "I work for a company that not only emailed everyone internally when there was a new employee, but also emailed out when someone had left the company within 3 days." Seems like a very reasonable practice. Len, what's your thoughts on that? Now, sometimes these human resource issues when someone leaves is kind of sensitive. Is that a good practice to inform everyone that someone has left?
That needs to be something needs to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. I think most organizations, if the person who's leaving the organization was in a sensitive position in relationships with their client base, you don't necessarily want to broadcast it to the world. You want to have the opportunity to do to cover that topic, directly, personally with the client base, and it's. I would expect that from a human resources and standpoint that would not be best practices to publish to the world when people leave a company. It's hard to fathom that the circumstances where that would be warranted, but I presume that it does happen.
Another question we have here for the panel is, users often have information about themselves scattered across social media. How do we prevent hackers using this information in social engineering attacks? So should we be educating users on what information they can share and not share on social media?
This is Jeff. I'll be happy to take that one. Yeah. This is, without a doubt, you cannot prevent hackers from using that information. So the only way to get in front of that situation is to be aware of what you're posting. So there's two veins. There's personal, and the obvious one, if you're posting, "Hey, I can't wait for my trip to Europe next week," and the whole family's going, none of us are going to be home, and that may not be something you want to post because you're saying my house is going to potentially be unattended for a week or two. But from a professional side, whether it's posting on a social media or discussing it at a restaurant over lunch or at a bar over drinks or at a meeting where there's other professionals, any information you have from the company that belongs to the company, you should be aware of what is the sensitivity, what could be shared publicly, what should not be shared publicly. If something shouldn't be shared publicly, then it doesn't matter if you're in a restaurant, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, it shouldn't be shared anywhere.
Good point. And Bill?
Yeah, spot on. Also, it's people.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and especially as people, it's more of getting back to training people and being aware of what they're sharing. People get a camera and don't realize that the GPS is on and they're putting a signature and they take pictures at their home, at their office. Now somebody can track them by what they're doing. Or they take a picture and forget that there's street signs or that kind of information in the background that gives away location. Or a document they may be holding, hey, our new contract with, and they disclose who who you just signed an agreement with that may be confidential because it hasn't been published yet or may have financial impact then. If it's a large company for the Security Exchange Commissions, people need to be very, very careful about what they disclose, either by posting or pictures, what have you. So.
And the next question is from one of our audiences: how much should we spend on security awareness training? Should we use a percentage of our budget, or do we use a risk-based approach? Anyone want to tackle that?
Sure. This is Jeff. My answer is neither. I don't think there is a good formula. In fact, I don't necessarily even believe in security awareness. and that may run contrary to what a lot of security professionals believe. I strongly believe in education and training, and there is a significant difference. Many security awareness programs occur once a year. You may have to take a test when it's done, and then the security people say, see you next year. And to me, the value in that is very minimal. However, a cultural inculcation of here's what's important to us and here's how we're going to act when these things happen, whether it's sharing of data or allowing people into systems or how much you share when you do customer service, that's a very important, vital part of how a culture is built. And from that perspective, shouldn't be looked at very differently from being part of all of the training budget, whether it's how to deal with customer service or when you're working in an R&D program, making sure people know what can and cannot be shared.
Yeah.
I
concur with Jeff, and I think we've also learned that the importance of effective external vulnerability scanning. I mean, who would not be doing that and consider that as part of their best practices? And we need to have something akin to a corollary for vulnerability scanning as an ongoing process for our vulnerability to social engineering as well.
Great. Well, I want to thank all the panelists. We're out of time. So Jeff, Len, Bill, thank you so much on behalf of InfraGard Atlanta. This has been another fantastic webinar. We appreciate all the valuable insights. And we look forward to seeing everyone on our next webinar. And if you stay online, we'll direct you to the URL and you can register for our next one coming up on August 10th. And we have a fantastic panel. Can't tell you who, but some really knowledgeable folks. And that topic will be on risk and reward, securing the Internet of Things. So look out for that. And thank you, everyone. And we appreciate your attendance today. Take care.